and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. For part 3 of our discussion, we will be focusing on our favorite and key moments of the second half of the novel. This episode contains spoilers.
That's a great intro.
So if you all don't mind spoilers, you're welcome to join us on this journey as we finish this incredible novel, Mexican Gothic. Who knows, maybe if you haven't read the book, it'll make you want to read it as we go over, as Vanessa said, the key moments that we found from the second half, which, like a roller coaster ride, really does pick up a lot of speed. But I hope, you are doing well. It's right around this, the holiday season. And this is a good little fireplace read, I think. And it definitely shows, I think, how this novel brings its Gothic nature to it, and the second half a lot more. So we'll talk about that. And as we were talking about pre-show, guys, I mentioned that I had my first passage on 154, and where we had left off, Catalina had suffered a seizure, and it was presumed that it was Noemi's fault for giving her that tincture. But I just had this little passage that I think ties in with actually the end of the novel, because in a way it's kind of like foreshadowing now that I think about it, because it says here, Francis says, it's the house. But by now the black gates with their snakes were in sight, the Ouroboros casting shadows upon the ground. It wasn't made for love, the house. Any place is made for love. Not this place and not us. You look back 2-3 generations as far as you can, you won't find love. We are incapable of such a thing. So Francis gets a little melancholic here. And I found it interesting because he kind of seems resigned, to being miserable. And I think it also shows him he's kind of cynical, but I think it's kind of a touching moment because, Noemi kind of fights that idea, right? And that's what I really like about her character, is like she's very resolute and isn't gonna always take no for an answer, right? So it also kind of represents a nice foil relationship, right? Because Francis, he's kind of gloomy, right, so to speak. But Noemi kind of just can't believe it, that like there can't be love here. And like I said, it does kind of foreshadow what ends up happening. But yeah, I just wanted to start off our discussion with this little moment. Between them two.
Yeah, I had the same passage highlighted actually, and it's funny. It in retrospect, it is very much tied in to the end, which I can't wait to get to. But I also like kind of add to your point. You also have the symbolism of the Ouroboros there reflected in that kind of philosophy, because I think they have a discussion on free will and whether or not, there's a lot about having to do about like the cyclical nature of things, and if you're stuck to a certain nature or fate. And that's kind of what the Ouroboros is, right? That's the snake eating itself like consistently, eternally, in that never-ending circle. And so I think that obviously it's the family symbol. And I think it's such a interesting metaphor for the way they cling on to the past, and more so again, kind of have these practices that hold on to the past and want to perpetuate that, moving forward into the future. And of course, as Francis, being this figure that feels stuck in it, but is he going to break out? Let's find out.
Yeah. And as they kind of develop their own relationship between themselves, I think Noemi grows more comfortable kind of confiding in him and vice versa, right? So it's kind of like a give and take in their relationship. But what else did you all have a little after this in the 160s or 170s?
I have 160.
Cool.
So last episode we talked a little bit about the different kinds of doctors that we see. So I thought it was interesting. So this is when Catalina is talking Noemi is talking to Dr. Caramillo and about Catalina's seizure. And she's talking about the tincture. And I thought it was interesting how Dr. Cummins calls Marta a quack. Just because like that whole, I guess, stigma between like natural remedies and like, I guess, like just healers in general. In comparison to like modern medicine, there's just like, I think there's like a stigma behind it. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think I think we talked about this also a little bit in our first episode in part 1, in that just how healers and curanderas are stigmatized by society, and Dr. Cummins kind of representing the family, right? He's speaking from that view of medical science as like, there's only one way to solve any kind of health issue you might have, versus, of course, Marta, who comes at it from a more holistic perspective, informed by Mother Nature itself. And how it kind of also shows Dr. Camarillo as a good foil to Dr. Cummings as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, this kind of explains what we talked about last time, right? That we wondered, well, did Marta cause that seizure then, not thinking that it might cause that seizure? And so we come to find that Dr. Camarillo kind of assures her that, well, Marta wouldn't do something like that if she knew it could have that kind of reaction. And then Dr. Camarillo tells her that, she had a reaction like that before, right? And so that kind of just brings up more questions for Noemi. And it kind of shows us that, Noemi wasn't wrong for trying to help her. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how, a lot of things we found out in the first half, guys, that we talked about are being explained from a different perspective here in the second half. And so this is one of them.
Yeah.
Did y'all have something a little after this in 160s or the 170s?
My next one was on 171.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is when Noemi is able to finally go and spend some time with Catalina again. And so they read a book. And I feel like this paragraph is like really, it like foreshadows, I think, what's happening. So the poem that they decide to read is called Foolish Men. Well, the poem that they turn to is Foolish Men. And then it says, Noemi turned the pages. There it was, the well-worn pages as she remembered. And there, too, was an unusual element, a yellow folded piece of paper tucked against the pages. Noemi glanced at her cousin. Catalina said nothing. Her lips were pressed tight, but in her eyes Noemi read a naked fear. She glanced in Mary's direction. The woman was still busy with the curtains. Noemi pocketed the piece of paper and began reading. So I think it's interesting that, so obviously what she finds here is a note from Catalina, But I think it's really interesting how the poem that she puts it on is Foolish Men, because they're trying to escape from these men in the house, essentially.
And the poet here, Sor Juana, is kind of known as like the Mexican matriarchal poet, right? Just like in American literature, or maybe like, you know, in American literature we have like Emily Dickinson, only because, you know, she was known primarily just for publishing poetry. Well, not publishing, right, but keeping poetry to herself, and then, you know, finally being seen as like a kind of literary Eve, because of how she kind of opened the door for other white women poets to publish their own work and be seen as writers. But yeah, I think it's definitely kind of interesting how, again, there's just more foreshadowing and more messages that Catalina is trying to convey. Richie, did you have any thoughts?
Not on that passage. You guys kind of said it. I just have my next passage is a little later, 176, 177.
Yeah, I had 174 and 175.
Nice.
It's just another small passage with Francis and Noemi, where you know, he's talking about how you know, how they had like a paint business, and you know, so they're talking about like what they want to do, right? And then here at the bottom, and sorry, I think this is no, sorry, this is Noemi talking about Hugo, right? And here at the bottom, she says, the narrator tells us she liked Hugo because he was a pretty boy, and she appreciated a fellow with a certain slickness who could dress well and play the game of charm. But she liked this man's quirks and imperfections, the lack of playboy smarts coupled with a quiet intelligence. Francis was wearing his corduroy jacket again, but in the privacy of his room, he walked around barefoot and had donned a rumpled old shirt. There was something lovely and intimate when he looked like this. And I just like that description a lot. You know, I can picture it quite well. But it also shows Francis. You know, I think we're seeing Francis at this point as a very round character, who's a bit quirky, and he's not exactly like stylish, but there's just something about him that shows he's sensitive and intelligent, and at the same time, importantly, different from the rest of the Doyles.
Yeah, nice passage, and they're definitely getting closer by this point.
Yeah, and well, the other reason I had that passage was because of how it contrasted him with Hugo, right? And so we kind of, you know, this is a kind of retrospective, right? Because it's telling us how Noemi was back then, why she was with Hugo, and Hugo seems to be kind of, you know, pretty different from Francis, right? So, but it kind of shows that she has different reasons for liking Hugo than she does for presumably kind of starting to fall for Francis here.
There you go. The Gothic meet cute. I had to mention it, just jokingly, of course. Yeah, awesome, man. It's funny. My passage is in the same scene. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Vanessa, before I moved it along.
No, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So in that same meeting that you're talking about, pretty much the next page over, you know, I mentioned that they have a budding friendship and closeness, and I think here you start to see Noemi confide in Francis and pretty much ask him, hey, is your house haunted? which I think obviously she's taking a risk in asking that, because she's had experiences, and so she's being a little bit vulnerable and kind of starting to open that conversation up. But I think the conversation that follows is pretty interesting because she's, they talk about hauntings as another way, like not ghost stories. And I think she says those lines right, because first of all, he's dismissive. There's no such thing as ghosts. But of course, speaking to Noemi and her curiosity and also her study of cultures, and I think it's an interesting combo on what it means to be haunted. She says on 176, but what if there were? Have you ever wondered about that? I don't mean ghosts under bed sheets, dragging chains behind them. I read a book about Tibet once. It was written by this woman called Alexandra David Neal, who said people there were able to create ghosts. They willed them into existence. What did she call them? Tulpa. She goes on to talk about other instances of there's some sort of parapsychological explanation or even a chemical explanation for the way in which we experience supernatural things. She goes into the phrase mad as a hatter, which I think I love this scene altogether because I think in past episodes we've alluded to it, and even in the pre-show we mentioned it. But here you have an instance where there's code switching, right? Where Francis starts speaking to her in Spanish, based on this conversation, because in his effort to look out for her, mentions that she needs to leave. She's getting a little too close to things here, and of course there's a lot of implications of the mystery happening. What's happening here in the house? And so pretty much it ends up with him telling her, right, Noemi, this is 177, just because there are no ghosts, it doesn't mean you can't be haunted, nor that you shouldn't fear the haunting. You are too fearless. My father was the same way, and he paid dearly for it. And so, he alludes to his father, Richard, who is deceased at this point. But I think drawing into the mystery of the house, we're really getting somewhere here. And so, again, I love, Silvia, what she's doing here, kind of setting up these explanations for supernatural events of hauntings, embedded in culture and anthropology, and again showing off Noemi's smarts, through her reading, her experiences through what she learns through reading, and also again the relationship of Francis here, trying to legitimately help her and warn her to leave because of what's coming, and again the whole code switching aspect in the sense that it's been hinted at, but things you say in the house can be heard unless it's in Spanish. So I really love these couple pages.
Yeah, I like that it tells us that we switch to Spanish for a moment, but I like that it's still in English because I don't know, I think it just makes it more consistent, I guess. And I think it also makes it more accessible to people that don't necessarily speak Spanish, but it still is able to introduce them to a lot of like Mexican culture. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we talk about that in episode 1, how interesting it is here in High Place where they don't speak Spanish, but they're in Mexico. And I mean, there's a lot to be said too about what Spanish means, in Mexico. But the fact that they refuse to speak it too says a lot. So yeah, awesome points.
Yeah, it's definitely a good plot device here, because sometimes you have these stories that are set in like exotic places, right, or faraway places, and it seems that those details are just kind of just kind of tacked on there, right, as an afterthought. But here, it's a good use of the language, and the whole scene about the vapors and the Mad Hatter, just like we had talked about with the mushrooms being hallucinogenic, and imbibed by indigenous cultures, we get some more of the chemistry here. And it reminded me of a museum exhibit I went to in Houston that they had for like science of like how people have died in strange ways because of chemicals. I can't remember the name of the exhibit, but it was just really interesting how it talked about, in the Victorian age, modern science was born. And, but, with that came a lot of errors, right? And so there was a lot of those toxic chemicals that people didn't know about, things that were radioactive, plants that were toxic that people didn't know were toxic, and so forth. So yeah, I like how this story kind of makes it possible, like I said, to talk about all these things from a historical perspective. I don't know if you all had anything in the 180s.
No.
No.
So I just had this one on 184 and 185. There are similar passages like this one. So it's kind of a good emblematic passage of the way that Virgil is. We talked about him gaslighting her in the first part of our podcast, first half of the podcast discussion. Here, once again, we get that open your eyes, Ruth said, right? And, I was reminded that she had seen a journal entry from Ruth, or at least presumed to be Ruth, because it was just the R period abbreviation, saying how, like, implying that just like Catalina, she was losing her senses. And so she was recording that for future people to see, right? So it's an interesting literary device because, those are messages in a bottle, in a time capsule, that Noemi, like a detective that she is able to slowly piece together, even though, as we come to find, it's even it's pretty confusing because of how much this involves that is unfamiliar to her. But anyway, 150, 184, 185. So she's sleepwalking again, and she has this vision, and she imagines bees, that are just all around her. And then here, she wakes up, or she comes out of this, right? And then it's Virgil who's there in his bed. And then Noemi says, I was taking a bath, because Virgil says that she's all wet. And she's asked, well, what were you doing? I was sleeping. And then on the next page, she thinks he's going to reach for her, right, to grab her. But supposedly he's like reaching for a towel. And so I just kind of like how he kind of dissimulates, and again kind of gaslights her into thinking that everything is normal, right? He kind of just says, well, have a sip of wine. But then at the bottom, we're told, he says, I hope it wasn't a bad dream, he replied, because she says, you were in my dream. And then we're told he smiled. The smile was sly. It was the same smile she dreamed, slightly malicious. So I just like the unreliable narrator that we have here with Noemi, because you get this other side of Virgil that is just very creepy and very kind of snake-like, right? Again, the whole Ouroboros thing. And so they end up having an argument about it, but she kind of feels drawn to him, right? And the way that it's explained, I mean, it kind of seems like carnal desire, but I think, as we come to find later on in the novel, right, there's something else going on. But yeah, I just like this scene because of how it kind of shows Virgil in that clear light versus earlier where it was kind of a little ambiguous.
Yeah.
And then I didn't have anything until 205.
I had 192, and then after that I had, like 198.
Yeah.
So like on 181 and 192, Naomi kind of has another vision. So she's in her room and she's the mold on the wall catches her eye. It's almost like it's dancing. And then so on 192, she goes up to it and it says, she reached a hand up as if to touch that section of the wall that was dirtied by the mold. The mold moved again, away from her hands, skittish. Then it seemed to change its mind. It pulsated as if it was bubbling up like tar, and it crooked a long, thin finger, beckoning her. There were 1,000 bees hiding in the walls, and she heard them buzzing as she pressed forward drowsily, intending to slide her lips against the mold. She'd run her hands across the shimmering gold patterns, and they would smell of earth and grain and of rain, and then they would speak 1,000 secrets. The mold beat to the rhythm of her heart. They beat as one, and her lips parted. So this whole scene had me like sitting on the edge of my seat. It's really, because you're like kind of sitting here reading it and you're like, no, don't do it. And then so Florence and Virgil then come into her room because they say that they heard her scream. And she's like, well, no, I didn't even yell for you guys. I don't know where I was going with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because immediately after, the mold doesn't even look like it's moving anymore, and it's everything goes back to normal right after that, almost. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like you still can't trust like if she saw that or not, or if that really happened. And then on 198, which kind of ties on everything together, it ends the chapter 18 with saying she wasn't sure of anything at all.
Yeah, I had marked that too as kind of showing how, for our narrator, she's already kind of torn down, right? That just like the yellow wallpaper, she can't make sense of what's real and what's not. Whether it's Virgil being a creep or whether it's the wall acting like it's alive. And Florence as well comes in here too, right? And she kind of scolds her for like cursing. So
and for smoking.
Oh yeah, for smoking too. So yeah, I think a lot of things here just kind of seem to break down her confidence. And like you were saying, Vanessa, that it kind of had you on the edge of your seat. I think this is a very like horror scene style passage, right? Because you kind of see this in a lot of horror movies, right? Where they think they saw something, whether it's a Candyman in the mirror after you say Candyman 3 times in the mirror. And it's the thing is though, right? I mean, sometimes that was really there and it just kind of went away. Right. So there is that as well.
It's a pretty popular trope, right? Like visually to incorporate of, and then of course whoever sees this questions their reality as always.
I also thought it was like, so it does confuse you a little bit also because like she just burnt her hand with the cigarette, but then she looks at her hand and like the burn is gone completely. Like it never even happened.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to like, the visions that she's having from the beginning. And if we kind of think about Catalina here, it might begin to explain Catalina sit a little more, right? Because, you have to wonder as a reader, well, if Noemi is going through this, is this why Catalina is the way she is,
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I had 204, 205. Did you guys have something, um, or maybe the same area?
I don't have anything before it.
We haven't talked about Howard that much, because he's kind of in the background in some scenes, right? And here, so he comes in and, it's another kind of horrific scene because, you know, we're told here on page 204 that Howard Doyle smiled at her, showing off his stained teeth, seeing we're black, and then he pressed his lips against hers. Naomi felt his tongue in her mouth and then saliva burning down her throat as he pressed himself against her, and Virgil propped her in place. And then on 205, she kind of is putting the dots together of like how Howard here as the Doyle, how he had come here to kind of, because it was like a holy site and, wanted to become rich because of the silver. And so she's taken into another vision of a cave, and it reminded me of I don't know if you all have seen, it's a film that was actually shot in El Paso, but in the same way that, you have people kind of ganging up against someone because of some kind of like dark ritual.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of Manos, The Hands of Fate.
A notorious film. I hadn't seen it. I haven't seen it, but
No.
I'm quite familiar with its lore.
Yeah.
A film,
Yeah,
not the lore of the film, but like it's pretty infamous.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's known as like one of the worst films of all time. But it's one of those, so bad it's good kind of films, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it did remind me a lot of this scene. And a little before she sees Howard up close, right? And like he's like filled with like these these like tumors, right? And so he's clearly not, like, she starts to kind of see Francis as well, right? Because like she realizes, well, it's got to be pretty crappy, right, for Francis to have to take care of Howard this way if he's in this kind of state. But then, of course, like here it gets a lot darker because, she's forced to kiss him, right? And it's all for this kind of ritual that we come to find later on. How it's because of the fungus.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I just had this scene because it's kind of like, those scenes where, it's just there's a clear disgust that the reader can detect, and
yeah,
but at the same time, I mean, it's pretty kind of sad too, right? I mean, the decrepit state that Howard is in.
Yeah, I had that passage highlighted too. It reminds me of something Lovecraftian. Just an image of this dark cult-like behavior during a dark ritual that we get a glimpse of, and into the history of the Doyles. I think it kind of reminds me of that, almost like a mythos, like you're looking at something that's historically happening, but resonates into our narrative. And we've talked about Lovecraft, kind of being an influence a little bit, with Howard's name and all that as well.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't thought about this scene in relation to Lovecraft, and that kind of I mean, I know he's known for that like cosmic horror, but there is a real horror here that is, more grounded, right? Because we come to find in, I don't know if you also had like 210, 211,
Yeah, I had 211.
Yeah, where we find out here as um, it says the fungus, it runs under the house all the way to the cemetery and back. It's in the walls like a giant spider's web. In that web, we preserve memories. We call that repository of our thoughts, of our memories, the gloom. And then it goes on to how like there's ancestral memories. It's a symbiotic relationship. She compares it to like tuning a radio station, right? That like you don't have access to all the stations because I guess it's serious, right? And you got to pay for the different packages or whatever. But I thought that was a really interesting twist. I don't know what you guys thought about it, but it reminded me of I think I mentioned last time that the game Last of Us, because it deals with like a fungus that infects people and turns it into like zombies and like parasites, right? Essentially. But
Is, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, which reminds me of like the Help in High Place, who are more zombie like. And it mentions that their minds have been carved out. So it kind of does, talk a little bit about the nature of the symbiotic relationship that this fungus has formed with the Doyles, with Howard, in the sense that they're not beyond taking advantage of other people, as we clearly see in the Doyle's history.
And Vanessa, what did you make of like when we finally found this out, that it was the fungus that was a big source of like why things were kind of off here?
I really liked that this is the direction that she decided to go in when she was making the book. Just because like there is that scientific explanation behind it. It just made me more curious, I think, about finding out about more about mushrooms and funguses or fungi.
Shout out to Incubus. One of my first thoughts was the Incubus debut album, Fungus Among Us.
I haven't heard that one, but
so that one's for Reina if she's listening. Yeah, I loved it. I like the build up because I mean, again, if you go back, there's like little clues throughout too.
Right. Yeah.
Where again, I think Noemi is sharp, so she's trying to like put things together, and that does come up a little bit about spores and the way it affects people. But this is pretty sinister version of that, right? With the gloom and the way it traps people in this case. And then of course it has to do with bloodlines, I think is one of the keys here.
And it reminded me also a little bit of like Del Toro's style of horror, and I don't know if that was intentional on the part of Silvia, given that we don't see too many Mexican horror directors in Hollywood, or any Mexican directors to begin with. But I like you said, Vanessa, I did like that there is this kind of scientific basis to it. And it is kind of it has that preternatural element too, right? Because if it can kind of possess those memories, right? I mean, it's kind of got that it's a form of possession that is different from demonic possession. So it I don't know, it's a different shade of horror. Because I know people react, can't, in some cases they can't take like demonic possession, right? But like if it's something like Resident Evil, right, where it's like zombies, it makes it a different kind of thing. And I don't know if you guys had more passages about the fungus.
I don't know, probably not till later on.
Yeah, not till later.
It is kind of funny. I like her, once it's revealed how this works, and so how the Doyles, Howard, like, are trying to essentially, right, what they're looking at is more immortality, in through this symbiotic relationship, and part of that is like trying to continue the bloodline, which is why there's such kind of incestuous type nature to it. I think Vanessa mentioned this in a previous episode, where you look at all the portraits of them and they all look so similar, and they're kind of very selective in who they bring in for the bloodline, and so once it's kind of revealed that Noemi is, like, being considered to be included in the family, she has that kind of very clever retort about the man, I should have had that page. I don't even remember what page is in, right? The Church of the Holy Incestuous Mushroom. I thought that was a pretty clever line.
Oh,
Funny amidst all this horror.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I think that's it for the fungus in terms of what's left.
Well, that reminds me, Richie. I don't know if y'all have seen Midsummer.
No.
but I
Because
know which one it
a.
is.
Do you know which one? Yeah,
Yes.
it's without spoiling it, it's similar in that, like, there's also kind of this idea of, like, suffering hallucinations because of psilocybin mushrooms or whatever kind of mushrooms or concoctions they take from this cult that's also incestuous, right? And so it reminded me of that, because it's also kind of meant to, like, preserve the bloodline, and being selective about who they bring in, and the protagonist, kind of, she's given, like, this crown, so you kind of wonder whether Noemi, as if they are going to take her as, like, the queen, right, the heiress,
Mm-hmm.
whether she's going to be given this crown of fungus in this case. But I had one on 232. I don't know if y'all had something before that.
I just had the paragraph on 229 where they explain about why they don't speak Spanish in the house.
I had a 217, just a really quick point or observation / connection.
Yeah, go for it.
So we learned that there's in this symbiotic relationship of the gloom and Doyle's, that there's sacrifice involved. And so I guess in reflecting on this, there's kind of the comparison of Doyle that reminds me of the Faustian legend, where the line is on the bottom of page 217. Clever Doyle, who was well learned and had read plenty of books on theology, biology, medicine, looking for answers, and now he'd found them. It's kind of that, in Faustian, what's the deal that you make? You've pursued all sorts of knowledge, but you're not satisfied, and so this leads to what are you sacrificing here to become part of this relationship? What do you lose? And so it's this very villainous kind of aspect, right, of how they end up sacrificing. At first it was willing, they referenced, right, it was people who are willing to sacrifice themselves, to the unwilling, I think, children, that they end up eating flesh. Was it the word has become flesh, as they say? Anyway, just quick connection. I wrote it down in my notes. Faust. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So then on 229, on the first paragraph, it says, well, it's Noemi and Francis having a conversation, and he's trying to get her to eat, and so she's asking him more questions and stuff, and then he says in Spanish, he can hear through the walls, through the house, but he doesn't speak Spanish. He won't understand. Keep your voice low. So that really just explains why at the beginning that's like the main rule that they have, is that they don't speak in Spanish, is because then Howard won't be able to understand them.
Yeah, like I had said, I really like how Sylvia is able to integrate the use of Spanish as a very interesting device that shows it's the whole kind of colonizer thing, right? So from a post-colonial perspective, it brings this novel into a different aspect. And I also like how like I said, right, that as you read this novel, things that happened earlier now start to make sense, and it really aligns really well. A little later on in that page, Vanessa, it also mentions how that's also why there was no smoking, right? That the cigarette also was affecting that, and that even the tincture was affecting that too, right? So that that might explain Catalina's seizure. Is the tincture was affecting the fungus, and the fungus, having infected Catalina, was reacting via a seizure, I guess, if that makes sense. So
I
yeah,
like the
go ahead.
paragraph at the bottom. Sorry, I like the paragraph at the bottom where it says, Catalina had figured out the tincture had an effect on the house. That was certain. Accidental or intentional. Her cousin had discovered the key, even if she had been prevented from turning it.
Yeah, I really like how Noemi is kind of is acting like in a very heroic way by resisting, and how Francis kind of already coming off here, right, as like the sidekick. So I thought that was interesting too. And then, she wonders, well, did the healer know this, right? And so there's that question for us readers that, Marta might have already known this, right? And that's why she had given that tincture.
Yeah.
And speaking of the tincture on 232, so she ends up taking it herself because I guess, it's going to act as a defense. But on 232, I like how Francis kind of represents himself. He says here, there's a cicada fungus, Mesospora cicadina. I remember reading the journal article which discussed its appearance. The fungus sprouts along the abdomen of the cicada. It turns it into a mass of yellow powder. The journal said the cicadas, which had been so grossly infected, were still singing, as their body was consumed from within. Singing, calling for a mate, half dead. Can you imagine? You're right. I do have a choice. I'm not going to end my life singing the tune, pretending everything is fine. So I like the symbolism of that scene, of that little passage a lot, because it shows that Francis has that, it's a kind of recognition scene for him, because now he has that epiphany where he sees that he's like that cicada, right? That even though he might still be quote unquote singing like a cicada, if as long as that fungus is still affecting him, it's still not him, right? And it's interesting too, there's that little touch of like the singing is like a mating call, and so there's that connection there to Noemi as well. But I like how Noemi, I think, has that presence about her and that air about her, that she's able to kind of make Francis into someone who is like her, also brave.
Yeah, that calls back to
the
passage.
I like how at the bottom. Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say that passage we brought up earlier is where he's talking about his fate. Again, the Ouroboros symbolism as well of fatalism and him wanting to break out of that, kind of falls into that self-reflexive passage. Does that make sense?
I was just gonna say, yes,
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just gonna add about how at the bottom of the page, how he tells her that because she's there now, like he's starting to like, I guess, open his eyes, and like he's not okay with like just pretending anymore because like he sees like what it's doing to her also.
Right. So in other words, like that he's doing it for her.
I wouldn't necessarily say that he's doing it for her, but because of her, he's able to realize what's going on. And like he's kind of like, I guess, distancing himself from the family already at this point.
Right. And then at the top too, right, you know, we wondered about the visions, and Francis explains it by saying that, you know, they're not really visions or dreams, or it's the gloom, right? And that, you know, she had already connected that like Virgil can seed them. So yeah, you know, that they formed that kind of pair here. You know, and he calls himself a coward, you know, for not like having spoken sooner, right? But I think, you know, that's good on his part, like better late than never, of course. But she realizes that they're going to be alone, you know, that they're going to have to kill Howard. What else did y'all have in the next chapter, like in the 230s or 240s?
I didn't have anything particular.
I mean, no, nothing really. I mean, we can talk about stuff, but yeah, nothing that I wanted to highlight.
I think on 240 and 241, you know, so now that Francis is kind of, you know, brave now, right? He's like the lion in Wizard of Oz who realizes he's brave. He confronts Virgil, and you know, so like Virgil's kind of taken aback by this, and you know, there's still that kind of connection that Naomi has to Virgil, right? Because, you know, she says, I'm not entirely me when Virgil is around. Not lately, magnetic. That's how Catalina described him. Well, no wonder, but it's not charm alone, is it? You set the house and can induce you to do certain things. Virgil brought out the worst in Naomi. She disliked them immensely. Freud talked of death drives, that impulse that makes someone standing at the edge of the cliff suddenly want to jump off it. What Virgil inspired was violence and carnality, but also a heady delight, the joy of cruelty and a velvet black decadence she had tossed only slightly before. This was her greedy, most impulsive self. You know, I like that Noemi, she's brave, she's smart. You know, she's able to make other people around her better. In this case, Francis and the doctors and Marta. But that she still has that vulnerability, right? And maybe it's like a fatal flaw, but that Virgil is still kind of has that power over her. And I like how it kind of brings up the Freudian perspective of the death drive, and kind of explains it that way, you know, that it isn't simply like, you know, that it's this kind of Freudian desire, but at the same time, you know, there's that gloom that isn't just the charm of that he has, right? That there's something else that is affecting her mind in a kind of like, you know, Jedi mind trick that he's using on her. So yeah, I just had that little scene. And then on 244, you know, we talked a little bit about the house. I don't know if y'all had anything in the 240s. But here on 244, it says, you know, the workers died there, right? And so we're told this house had been built atop bones, and no one had noticed such an atrocity. Rows and rows of people streaming into the house, into the mine, and never leaving. never to be born, never to be found. The serpent does not devour its tail, it devours everything around it, voracious, its appetite never quenched. I don't know if you also marked this passage, but I really like the how, just like The Shining, just like Poltergeist, there's this idea of the consequence of sacrilege. The idea that there's these families that ended up suffering because of the Doyles, the miners and the workers, and they just built on top of all of that. So I just like the symbolism of that. That's not going to go unclaimed. That, in other words, that's not going to be without consequence.
Mm.
And kind of bringing up, the Ouroboros here as well, and the idea that it kind of just destroys everything, not just its own tail.
It's almost like when you're like so self-involved, you're not aware of how your actions affect others as well, in a weird way. I think. I mean, we've talked about the land, the history of the land in the past, and so so I think it's just a further in-depth look at that.
I mean, it makes an interesting contrast with something like Guatlica Girl, right? Because Guatlica Girl, the speakers and narrators there are acutely aware of the land, right? They care and tend to it, versus this one where the land is just something to own and its resources are yours for the taking, including the people, right? Because they just end up literally almost possessing the people too.
Yeah. And there's that colonial aspect that I think we brought up in episode 1.
Right.
Yeah, that's that contrast is stark in that sense. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see it here too, how separate they are from the village, separated in many ways, elitist and refusing to adopt culture and again hurting the indigenous people there.
Exactly. And I just wanted to juxtapose it real quick on 269. It's referenced again, where it says, Florence, it's kind of a get out scene because she's holding a gun to her at this point, because now that they're onto her, and Noemi says, Virgil tried to rape me. He tried to rape me and I should have killed him back there. And then Florence, just shushes her, right? Like, shows, of course, the kind of person that she is. But it's also implied that like this has happened before, right? So again, the whole cyclical nature to all this. And it says, Francis had now reached Howard's bedside and was speaking to the doctor. Their voices low. He's your son, Noemi whispered. It's a body, Florence replied. A body. That's what they were all to. That's what they all were to them. The bodies of miners in the cemetery, the bodies of women who gave birth to their children, and the bodies of those children who were simply the fresh skin of the snake. And there on the bed lay the body that mattered, the father. So I just like that as well. Like you were saying, that the colonial component to it, but also very Gothic at the same time. Did you all have any passages from the 270s here or the 260s?
Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about chapter 24, which starts on 255. And this is the scene. So Noemi and Francis are getting married. And so this chapter is kind of like the ceremony for the most part.
And it's kind of a shotgun wedding, isn't it? Because this is when, like, it's all because of the ritual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me see. Hmm, I'm trying to find a good line because there's so many in this chapter. Hmm. Well, I guess so. It starts on 255, but then the ceremony is over by page 258, and then it says they had exchanged only a handful of words through the wedding ceremony, and it was apparently all over. Virgil now motioned for Francis to follow him, while Florence took hold of Noemi and led her out of the room into her own chamber. So now, so essentially the only reason why they are asking them to get married is so that Howard is able to, I guess, go into the next person, I guess. I don't know how to describe that perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, as Howard being someone who is like almost literally like a rotting corpse, right? He needs to find a new vessel. And so, it's presumed to be Virgil, because like he's more virile and stronger or whatever. But what did you make of like towards the end of this chapter where there's that kind of, the kind of the proverbial, where forget who, but in Charlie Brown, where like they pull the football away, right? And
Lucy.
so, yeah, there you go.
Appropriately named, by the way. Lucy, Lucifer, what? Just kidding.
What did you make of that? What did y'all make of that? Where Virgil kind of comes in and wants to like right away take control of Noemi.
I didn't know what to think of that because she just got married to Francis, and then so she's taken back to her room, and they like kind of set it up for the wedding night, and then Virgil comes in and instead.
Yeah.
I think it goes into their whole the whole cycle of the family. Just because like now she's part of the family, so Virgil's like, oh well, I'm also part of the family, kind of thing is how I saw it.
Yeah, I mean, Virgil tries again his own gaslighting routine, right? Because he's like, well, you want me, right, kind of thing, and that very like almost like a metrosexual kind of way, in the sense that like he thinks of himself very highly, but again, she kind of does of course try to fight back, and at the end of the chapter she pushes Virgil off, and that's where like I guess he's knocked out, because he like hit his head on the floor or whatever. So that's how she's able to get away. But you do kind of wonder, well, like she was about to get raped, right? But she's able to escape. And we're told that like she could have killed him, but she thinks about running away first.
Which I thought was because she has the opportunity to grab the knife, but instead she decides that getting Catalina and getting out of the house is more important.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those like the horror movie scenes, right, where like you can kill the monster or you can run away, right? So it's like those split-second decisions, and
yeah, this again, we've talked about the momentum in the build-up, but at this point, right, it just there's no way you can put the book down. No, what's gonna happen?
Well, going a little forward on 270 and 271, unless you all had something before that.
I'm not. Go ahead.
Um, it reminded me a little bit of like, let the right one in. And I know you said at the beginning, Richie, if they're vampires.
Wow.
Um, um, because it says she's been told, renounce yourself. That's what he demanded in the dream. That's what mattered now. There was a physical component, but there was also a mental one, a surrender that must be granted. So it reminded me, of course, of like how you have to kind of ascend. It's kind of similar to, I guess, demonic possession too, in a way. In some
Mm.
cases, because like if you don't grant access, if you don't, let them walk in the door or whatever, then you're going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I like that there is that component to this too, and it kind of makes sense with the gloom being something that is psychological as much as it is like physical.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I like here at the bottom, that um, Catalina kind of finally wakes up, right? She takes the scalpel and
Mm-hmm.
she kind of goes in a rage and on 271, it says Catalina became a Maenad. Her frenzy stabbing, the scalpel bit the neck, the ear, the shoulder, brought forth a river of black pus and dark blood, splattering the covers. Howard yelled and shook as if an electric current ran through his body. And the others in the room echoed him, their bodies convulsing. The doctor, Flores, Francis, seized by a terrible paroxysm. Um, so I like how this scene. It's Catalina who it becomes the aggressor. I think I think it's a good choice instead of having it be Noemi, and that that going after Howard, right, is what seems to, of course, in turn affect the other ones too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting kind of twist as well, right, of the scalpel or whatever, because Catalina was seen as like very passive throughout this novel. But now that finally she's able to kind of come out of it, right, come out of the daze or whatever, um, when she finally is herself, right, this is her first reaction. And again, Richie, I'm reminded of Get Out. If you remember,
Mm-hmm.
the latter half of that film, there's a very similar scene, right, of where a character is finally takes revenge or whatever. So I like that, because it's violent, but it's that kind of violence that is satisfactory. And I think that's one of the another Gothic tropes, where the victim becomes the avenger.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely love that. Cool. Cool. We're in the 270s, you said?
Yeah,
Yes.
270s,
Okay.
280s.
Okay.
Go
All
ahead.
right. Well, I mean, I definitely, I don't know about you guys, but I wanted to share two passages about the gloom / Agnes, like the description. I think it's so gothic, but also so tragic in a way too. I think it's summative in a unique way, like is kind of also this trope of where the monster isn't there's more to the humanity to the monster than we realize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. With that said, I wanted to. I mean, I don't know what you guys had, but there's two passages that I think are just like beautifully descriptive on 284 and 289 of Agnes as the gloom.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. If you don't mind, this will probably be the last thing I share for this episode, and I'll jump in with whatever you guys say. So on page 284, adding to the description of the gloom that you shared on 211, Jorge, we learn more, and we know that Agnes. So Agnes is Howard's first wife, right?
Right.
Okay, and so once this fungus discovered, it ends up kind of taking over her and her corpse. So here's kind of a passage that I think describes that, but in a way there's a tragic nature to it. Yeah, it's the middle of the page, and and again it references how the gloom has this opportunity to trap memories and other people there as well within it. All the ghosts were Agnes, or rather, all the ghosts lived inside Agnes. No, that wasn't right either. What had once been Agnes had become the gloom, and inside the gloom there lived ghosts. It was maddening. It was not a haunting, it was a possession, and not even that, but something she couldn't even begin to describe. The creation of an afterlife, furnished with the marrow and the bones and the neurons of a woman made of stems and spores. I think there's our description of our monster right there, which I think is pretty terrifying. I love that sentence. Furnished with the
Mhm.
marrow and the bones and the neurons of a woman made of stems and spores. So it's a pretty shocking image, right? And again, so we discover, as I said in the previously in the book, it lives in the cemetery, so which is referencing, this is kind of where the gloom is based on, like in the crypts, right? And the crypt is also
Mhm.
where you have this dark ceremonial space where they kind of proceed with some of these rituals of sacrifice in name of the gloom. And then a little later on, a couple 289, you have another description here that I think just hammers the nail so violently on what Gothic is, and what I think Silvia is doing with Mexican Gothic. 289, middle of the page, a realization about Agnes slash the gloom. Yeah, it goes. And it struck her all of a sudden, this fact that she had missed, which should have been obvious from the very beginning, that the frightening and twisted gloom that surrounded them was the manifestation of all the suffering that had been inflicted on this woman, Agnes. Driven to madness, driven to anger, driven to despair, and even now, a sliver of that woman remained, and that sliver was still screaming in agony. Yeah, these I think those two passages in particular just hit me a
Mhm.
certain way in terms of like describing both a very, very terrifying monster, but also having a strange humanity to it of what Agnes was, and her, again, the manifestation of her despair, which I think we've talked about that in previous episodes, is the Gothic trope of madness, in particular, uh, really in relation to women. So there you go. I don't know. What did you guys think about
Mm.
those? Did you? I'm sure you had them highlighted too.
Yeah. I liked, well, since we're already on page 289, I I like how it describes like why this is the cycle.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay. And then in that sentence after what you read, it describes her as being the Ouroboros.
Yeah.
So I think that that's really interesting because that's the family symbol. So she's able to connect like it to the root of what's going on with the gloom.
Mm-hmm.
That she was causing the vision too, right? That she was the one whose
The
eyes were closed
the
but wanted
golden.
to open them.
Yeah. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I love this. I love this reveal. Oftentimes I think sometimes
Mm-hmm.
in not just in novels, but more so like even in movies, sometimes when the monster is revealed, it's kind of disappointing. Like, oh man,
Mm-hmm.
that's it. But in this case, I think it just deepens it, the experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely not like anything that is cheap. It's not this old man behind the curtain who turns out to be the monster. Um,
You can see
and
the sleeper
I,
on the costume. Just kidding.
huh?
Sorry. I was just breaking down fourth walls too.
I do like you said, that it is rooted in this feminine madness that is manifested and ultimately powers the gloom, right? And so we keep like turning over stones that, first we thought it was Howard, then we thought it was the gloom, and it turns out Agnes powers the gloom, right? And so there's a lot of like, it's a web, right? And that Ouroboros as well. It also goes a little bit into like the self-destructive nature that it all had, at the same time, because it is Ouroboros, it shows again that like, there's that desire to preserve life as well, right? Why Howard still wanted to keep alive. And again, I mentioned Rise of Skywalker, right? That, just like the Emperor had those clones and wanted to pass on his consciousness onto Rey, so too does Howard. And but I do like that, I do like that it kind of does root it in matriarchal power, even if it is kind of in the more dark sense, in a darker sense.
Right.
I also, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that I like this in comparison, like the description of the buzzing that we hear throughout, like in the walls and everything, is actually her screaming. But in comparison to what we discussed earlier with like the cicadas of how they're singing, I think that that's a really nice contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice one.
Yeah, there's a lot of poetic details, that like, again, retrospectively, everything just falls into place, right? And that's one of the things I really like about this novel. And so they end up going back to town, and Noemi and Francis end up together, and she's like, well, I'm going to introduce you to my dad, right? Because she realizes, she can't leave him there. And I don't know if you all had anything from the end, but it's just the denouement or whatever.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Well, Vanessa, did you want to read the ending so that we could just talk about how, this kind of ends in well, we could talk about, what you guys thought about the ending.
Sure. The last paragraph?
Yeah, the very last one.
Okay, sure. So this is on page 301, and it says, "The future," she thought, "could not be predicted, and the shape of things could not be divined. To think otherwise was absurd. But they were young that morning, and they could cling to hope. Hope that the world could be remade, kinder and sweeter. So she kissed him for a second time, for luck. When he looked at her again, his face was filled with such an extraordinary gladness, and the third time she kissed him, it was for love."
So once again, Francis had said, there could be no love. He was that kind of hopeless, unromantic, so to speak. But, they do end up kissing for love. And, I like how this ends. It still kind of leaves open the possibility that the fungus could have survived, because they end up literally burning everything down. But I forget who says that, like, actually some of the fungus could survive, right? So it kind of leaves open the possibility that, there's going to be a sequel to this, right? Which would be really interesting. But at least here with Francis and Noemi, they end up embracing, and it's kind of seems like it's very melancholic and very sweet, and very hopeful. And it's 3 times, right, that they end up kissing for luck, for love, and but yeah, what did you all make of this ending?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think at the beginning of the episode, I think that's one of the first passages we read is where he's mentioning that you won't find love when talking about High Place and the family. We are incapable of such a thing. And so it's nice to see that aspect broken down. Very hopeful passage, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's satisfying. I like that both Noemi and Francis survived. I don't know if I would have liked it if like one of them would have died, as like a form of sacrifice. Or, if Francis would have had to stay behind to let her escape or whatever. But I like, that they end up together. So I thought it was a good ending. Kind of brings up a little bit of the Gothic romance. This is I definitely can't wait to see this on the little screen, right? If it is going to be adapted for Hulu. And should be an interesting series that I think can go a lot of different directions.
Yeah. I'm so curious to see how it's adapted. I mean, so many scenes are so cinematic as it is. And again, like we were provided a soundtrack, and so as soon as I finished, I started playing it. Like I didn't want to play it while I was reading, just because I would have been like, wait, is this supposed to match up with this scene? No, but it's kind of more of a mood, and so I definitely recommend it. If you guys have, once you finish it, definitely go to Spotify and check out the Mexican Gothic soundtrack that Silvia Moreno-Garcia put together, and be on the lookout for the show. Absolutely. I don't know. What would you look forward to in the show, Vanessa?
I don't know. I think just being able to, I guess, see it, someone else's version of the house, like what they picture it to be like. I would like to, like also the visions. Like I think that's going to be really cool to see. Just all of it, I guess.
Yeah, same here. And I would hope that, that it doesn't whitewash like Mexican culture, because I think Coco is a recent example of a good adaptation. I mean, a good representation of Dia de los Muertos, even though it does kind of bring in some new elements in there. But, the one before it, Book of Life, kind of just totally, made a mess because it wasn't as authentic to me. So I would just hope that it remains authentic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, I think it would be a great way to both get people more into the Gothic and get people more into like Mexican folklore as well.
True. That I hope it does.
Well, this is our last episode on this novel, and it's also our last episode of the year. So I want to thank our listeners who've followed us or who have recently joined us. We will be continuing next year with some books of poetry, some more fiction. So keep an eye out for announcements as far as that goes. But we're very excited to continue this. We hope everyone has a spooky holiday season. Maybe reading this by the fireplace as they keep warm and drink some hot chocolate with marshmallows or whatever. But yeah, we hope that you'll continue reading along with us.
Yeah, what he said.
Thanks for joining us on this discussion of Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Join us on our next episode as we begin Some Are Always Hungry by Jion Yoon, and if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy and share it with a friend. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.